My name is Linda Jillison, and as some of you know who have been at the rest of the series, I get the chance to introduce our wonderful readers of poetry for these evenings, and also the lecturers who are here. This is the penultimate in our 17th annual Alumni Association lecture series. So if you weren't aware of this lecture series before this, you should be aware of it. It happens every February and March, so look out for it next year because it's always wonderful. First of all, I have to ask everybody to turn off cell phones if you haven't done that yet, so that they don't interrupt us as we're listening to the lecturer. And then just a couple of more announcements. We are out of place here tonight. Usually we're in the University Center Theater, as most of you know. Next week we'll be back in the University Center Theater. So if you come for next week's lecture, don't come here, just go on down to the theater and you'll find us there. There are going to be DVDs of all of these wonderful lectures available, and they'll be available for purchase at the end of the series, and they will be available for you to acquire yourself at the beginning of May. So if you'd like a chance to be able to listen to these lectures again, I think that's an excellent opportunity, and they're only $10, and we'll be able to fix you up with one. The series is, as you probably know, if you're a usual attender, broadcast on MCAT. MCAT is here taping tonight. Thanks for being here. And the series will be rebroadcast on MCAT beginning on March 30th. And then the same lecture will be played again on the following Friday, and they go all the way through April. So again, you can catch up on those if you missed some of the earlier ones. Next week, we have our usual reception or party after Emily's lecture, and we'll be down in the 300 numbered rooms at the other end of the third floor here. So after the lecture, just wander on down there. Somebody will be able to show you where to go, and we always have a good time and get a chance to talk with all of the lecturers who have been in the series, so that's great. And then we'll also ask you next week for your input about what you'd like to hear for next year. And it's always fun for us, those of us who are on the committee, to get together and read everybody's recommendations and see what we can put together for the following series. So that'll come up next week. We'll be able to give you that opportunity. So the first thing I do officially every week is to introduce a really wonderful guest of ours. His name is Eduardo Chirinos. He's one of my colleagues in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures, and he's a really world-renowned poet. We're very, very fortunate here at the University of Montana to have Eduardo on our faculty, and he's a wonderful teacher as well. Our students are very lucky as well to have him to work with. Eduardo, as is our custom, is going to read one of his poems, and then Jeff Badnock is going to come over and read the English translation of it. I do want to point out to you that the poems are accompanied with illustrations in this wonderful little book, which has thus far been put out only in Spanish, but will be out in a bilingual edition, I believe next month, in April. And the artist is here who did the illustrations, and you'll be looking at one of the illustrations soon. And David Miles Lusk, let me ask you to stand up. He's here on the front row. Everybody give him a round of applause, because he's a wonderful talent. It's been a real pleasure to get to know you. So first of all, Eduardo, come and do your reading in Spanish, and then Jeff will follow up.
Good evening. The poem of tonight is actually a lament of one of the ugliest birds in the world, the Hydropsalis climacocerca. Where is the Hydropsalis? It was gone. It's the nightjar. I will read my poem in Spanish. No soy un ave favorecida por la belleza. Soy vista como una mezcla de sapo, serpiente y pajarraco. Para colmo, me asocian con la llegada de la muerte. Todo por la fealdad de mi canto, por la proverbial apertura de mi pico. En Francia me llaman sapo volador, en Alemania portadora de brujas. Como ven, tengo muchos nombres y ninguno me favorece. Mi nombre vulgar es mamacabras, pero ¿acaso las aves beben leche? A mí me interesan los insectos, que puedo engullir con solo abrir el pico. Me gustan las moscas, los escarabajos, las mariposas nocturnas. El Nuevo Mundo me ofrece un poco más de consideración. Los indios brasileños me llaman Madre de la Luna o Luna que llora. Los guaraníes, pájaro fantasma, por mi canto tenebroso y triste. Gracias.
No, I'm not a bird that's been favored by beauty. I'm considered a mix of toad, snake, and hideous fowl. To top things off, people associate me with death, all because of the ugliness of my song and the proverbial opening of my beak. In France, they call me the flying toad. In Germany, the witch carrier. As you can see, I have many names, none of them flattering. I also commonly go by goat suckler. But since when do birds drink milk? I'm interested in insects, which I can gulp down just by opening my beak. I especially like flies, beetles, and nocturnal butterflies. The New World affords me a little more consideration. Brazilian Indians call me Maidalua or Coralua, and the Guaranis, ghost bird, on account of my dark, sad song.
So here you can see one of David's works. I think they're really quite extraordinary. Next, I want to introduce to you our lecturer for this evening. Probably you all know who he is, and that's why you've come out this evening in numbers unprecedented, I think, for this lecture series. So I thought I would just actually start to read the introduction, and whenever you get tired of it, just let me know, and I'll stop. Because usually I don't know enough about these people to really, I always have to ask them, tell me something about yourself so I don't have to read the program. And then I was blessed with this 4-page story a week or so ago. Erick I've known for many years. I asked him exactly when he came here, and he said about 25 years ago, but he does say he remembers swimming in Lake Missoula. So he thinks he's pretty old, and I think life has been really good to you, Erick, if you were swimming in Lake Missoula. I know of him as a person who's very interested in students. I heard him give a presentation at a freshman convocation some years ago, which was really quite wonderful. And it's hard to keep a group of freshmen spellbound, but I have to say that, as I recall, they were that time. As you read in the paper, if you did read in the Kaiman, Erick has come to us by a rather alternative or extraordinary route to the University of Montana. And straight through his life, he's been pursuing a couple of interests, and those are birds, which he started with very, very early when he was in high school, and also music. And so tonight we're going to be able to see a presentation in which he puts these two things together. He says that they really keep him going as far as his research goes, and that here's the clue to looking as early as young as Erick does if you've been swimming in Lake Missoula. He says that his students keep him young and enthusiastic, and I'll bet that's the case. So Erick, I'm just going to go away and let you come on up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see all of you this evening. How's the volume? Is it okay? Louder? How's this? Is that better? Okay. All right, I'd like you all to close your eyes for a minute. What you're listening to is the sound of the Australian forest waking up in what's known as the dawn chorus. And this was recorded in the Walimi National Park in Australia. There's probably about 80 species of birds that you just heard in this dawn chorus. And birds are consummate chatterers. Of any group, birds communicate with each other using sound almost more than any other group of organisms. So here's a recording I made of a marsh wren down in Lee Metcalf. And birds communicate an awful lot of information using sound. Most birds, for example, chickadees and robins, and this marsh wren has thousands of different distinctly different songs that it will sing. Chickadees and robins say over 30 or 50 different things. We're only now beginning to understand what they mean, decipher the sort of language of birds. And so tonight my task is, I hope to convince you, if anybody ever calls you a bird brain, I hope you take that as a compliment of the highest regard. And what I'm going to talk about tonight are several things. I feel really lucky that my twin passions of nature and music have allowed me to find a job that people pay me to study how animals communicate with each other using sound. And I'm going to talk about several different things. Birds say a lot of different things using sound. They talk to their mates, they talk to their chicks. But I'm going to focus on just a couple things that we know the most about. Love and war. And so I'll start by talking about songs, which are mainly courtship signals for mostly males to attract the babes. And I'll also talk about the really fascinating subject of how young songbirds acquire their song, how they learn to sing. This is vitally important. And I'm going to make the point that this is really like jazz. And it's sampling information, acoustic information that's out there from our elders, putting it together in new ways. And also the neurological wiring that birds use to learn to sing, we also share that. And so what I'll be telling you about how birds learn to sing is pretty much exactly neurologically how we learn to speak. I'll also then talk about something we know considerably less about, and that's sounds, very particular sounds birds make to warn about predators, about danger. And so this is an area that my students and I are actively looking into right now. So I'm going to tell you about some cool stuff that's ongoing. Let me just convince you that birds are amazing. Oh, the other thing that's very, very cool about what we're going to be talking about tonight is since the earliest times, people have been fascinated by the sounds, the songs of birds. And so music, there's so many connections between music and birdsong. And I bet that the earliest people with a bone flute in a cave somewhere when music was first invented were mimicking the songs of birds. Here's a bobolink. These are really interesting birds in the blackbird family. And here's a recording of a bobolink that I made just down near Target Range. And I'm going to be showing you a bunch of what are called spectrograms tonight. These are graphical representations of sound. So here's what the song of a bobolink looks like stretched out kind of on a musical staff. And you read it just like music. This axis is pitch. So just like on a musical staff, if a note is higher up, it's higher. If it's lower down, it's lower. Okay, this goes up to about 10 kilohertz. We can hear up to about 18 or 20 kilohertz, but you can see that most of this bird song is about 8 kilohertz or lower. And then along this axis is time. So just like musical notation on a staff, we have notes high up, it's high, If it's lower, it's a lower pitch, and time goes along this axis. Just looking at this, you can see that bobolinks say an amazing diversity of tracings on this spectrogram. I'm going to play it in real time first. So this is what a real bobolink sounds like in real time. Okay, he had a lot to say, didn't he? Now, a really important point I want to make here is our ability as humans to process sound information, especially in what's called the time domain along here, is really crappy. We know that birds hear this as if it's slowed down, but when I played this in real time, we couldn't even follow this. So now I'm going to play it slowed down. We know from a lot of studies that birds must be able to hear these sounds as if they're slowed down. So to a bobolink, this is perhaps what it sounds like. Now I'm going to point out we can follow along on the spectrogram. Okay, so this is just one song. Each male bobolink has 2 songs that it sings. So they're different. They're about the same length. And each young male learns those 2 songs that are from his hayfield. Okay? And so again, let me just play this real time. Okay, here's another one of my favorites. This is a bird that I fell in love with in New Zealand, the tui, a really remarkable bird. Here's its song. It's, again, it's really pretty amazing. These guys yak forever. They're pretty astounding. You can see there's this, if you do this for a little while, you can get good at reading these sounds. So these are very, very harsh sounds. We've got these sorts of notes with what are called overtones, are a little bit sweeter. We've got lots of complex stuff going on. So now let me play this slowed down again to about a quarter real speed. So now, with our poor hearing ability, we can start to appreciate the acoustic complexity. All right. So these birds are singing pretty amazing stuff. We can appreciate it at some level, but again, if somebody calls you a bird brain, if you can do that, you've got some stuff going on in your head that's pretty remarkable. All right. What I'm going to talk about now is pretty astounding. How do young birds learn to sing? And there's been some really great studies. So Kriya Brunner talked a couple of weeks ago about white-crowned sparrows and her amazing studies of stress physiology of these birds. There's also been some great studies of white-crowned sparrows looking at how they sing. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what was in the textbooks. So here's a baby sparrow, and here's the sorts of experiments that have been done. So you can go out and take an egg, before it hatches, take it out of the nest, so there's the beak just coming out, bring it into the lab, stick it in a little cage. It's got fluorescent light, water, food, everything it needs, and you can stick in its cage a speaker, just like this, okay? So as this little baby grows up, we can play it various sorts of sounds and see what happens. So this thing is living in a cage. It doesn't see or interact with any other birds, okay? Here's a rather cruel experiment. If it doesn't hear anything, so here's the age of the chick from hatch, so just hatching. This is about a 10 or 12-day-old chick and getting up to close to a year or so old. If you don't play it any sounds, what do you think happens when it grows up? So if it just silence, I see some head shaking. These, as the males grow up, they do not know how to sing. They have no song of their own, okay? This is kind of like these sad cases you hear occasionally of little kids who are stuck in a closet when they were little, and then somebody finds them and takes them out and they don't know how to speak. It's kind of like that. All right, so here's something pretty amazing. If you, to these little birds, if you play them if you broadcast on these speakers, the song of a white-crowned sparrow, so it's not seeing any other birds, it's just hearing stuff. If you play it when it's really young, about 0 to hatch to 10 days old, or say 50 days older, so during really young and 50 days on, it hears white-crowned sparrow's song. When it grows up, it still doesn't know how to sing. It has no song, it's clueless. It might as well have heard nothing its whole life. Okay, here's where it gets really, really cool. There's what's called the sensitive phase that's about, for white-crowned sparrows, about 10 days, when it's a little tiny thing, to about 50 days old. So this bird would be right in here in the sensitive phase. If during that phase of brain development, it hears its own song, sometime later when it's a teenager, it's starting to babble and it's got what's called subsong. And then later on, when it's a full adult, it develops and it sings a perfectly good song of white-crowned sparrow. Okay? Pretty astounding. Now, here's where it gets even more amazing. You can do the same experiment with a little white-crowned sparrow chick, and you have your speaker in there, but instead of just playing white-crowned sparrow's song, you can have a smorgasbord. You can play 50 different songs of 50 different species. So Nashville warbler, chickadee, and chipping sparrow, and one of those in the list of 50 is a white-crowned sparrow song. And what happens if you play these young birds lots and lots of songs is they still innately recognize their own species song, and we know that when there's something special about the acoustic features of their own species song that gets auditory neurons to fire massively to the brain to say, those are my people, and whatever that is, I got to learn that. And so there's this interesting mix of an innate, genetically hardwired recognition of their own species song, but also this learning. They have to hear it and practice it and so forth. So this is what was in the textbooks for quite a while, that there's this sensitive phase for acquiring language, so to speak, and an innate recognition of your own species signal, okay? Then along came a fellow named Luis Baptista who did a fascinating experiment. And what he did was this. He replicated the same experiment, took little chicks, and played them on a speaker white-crowned sparrow song. Okay, so they were hearing white-crowned sparrow song. So we know from all those previous experiments they should have recognized that and learned that song. But what he did, the twist he did, is he put in the cage a live bird with the white-crowned sparrow. But it wasn't another white-crowned sparrow, it was a strawberry finch, which is a completely unrelated bird from Southeast Asia. And here's its song acoustically. It's very, very, very different from a white-crowned sparrow. So this young bird had something live to interact with and cool and hang out and sort of check out this older guy. What do you think this guy did? Okay, so these young birds, if there's something alive to interact with, even though they're hearing their own song, which we know they innately recognize, the social interaction completely overrides that innate sort of predilection for singing its own species song. So this sort of put some brakes on things, and people realized that what we learn from having birds in little cages with fluorescent lights and water and food is not the whole story. That nature out there is glorious and complex, and social interactions and the ecological details are really, really important in what we see in nature. And people have actually known this for a long time. People have made their living off of it, actually. Knowing that young birds like something live to interact with and will learn whatever they hear from that live thing. So here's a picture of a fellow playing. He's got young birds in cages, and he's playing them tunes. So this is before iPods. And so the birds would learn to sing whatever he was playing. And so that would override their natural tendency to sing their own species songs. And so this guy could teach young birds the pop tunes of the day. And then he could take them to the market and sell them, and you could hang them up, and you'd have stereo around your castle and stuff like that. So people like this could make a fine living teaching young birds to sing. And here's actually a really interesting musical book, Bird, I love these old titles, Bird Fancier's Delight, or Choice Observations and Direction Concerning Ye Teaching of All Sorts of Singing, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So this book, and I have the 1717 edition of this book, and I'm going to play for you the tunes of the linnet. And people back then even understood that there was this sensitive phase, that if you played songs to birds too early, they wouldn't learn it. Too late, they wouldn't learn it. You had to do it. There was a sweet spot. Okay? And back then, they called that the recording phase. And that's why these are called recorders. Okay? So I'm going to play for you the tunes, a tune that was for teaching to linnets, which are bird, common European bird. It goes on and on. There's like several movements and so on. So I've got like tunes to teach 50 different species of birds here. And this tradition continued for a while. Check this out. Here's a canary training record, the Hartz Mountain Canaries. We just managed to get this to library. This is a rare 45 with the Hartz Mountain Canaries with organ and marimba accompaniment. Okay, so people bought this record, and there's ads on the back for Hartz canary food. But so people would play this 45 record to their captive young canaries, and it would teach them to sing. Okay, and I'm going to play you some of this just to show you how gloriously hideous marimba and organ accompaniment and canaries are. And I apologize ahead of time. You're probably going to be, this is going to be stuck in your head for the next few days, and I apologize. Just to make sure it's stuck in your head. Okay. Now, all of this that we've been doing in the Hartz Mountain Canary and the guy playing me playing my pathetic recorder, this would have been grossly insulting to birds because their vocal abilities are so astounding. The bobolink and the tui song I played, they can do stuff that's just way, way, way faster than we can even neurologically process. So all of this stuff is probably grossly insulting to birds. They could learn to sing it and copy it very easily. But for songbirds, it's even more amazing because we have one sound-producing membrane called the larynx. So if my brain tells my muscles to tighten my larynx, my voice gets higher. Or if my brain tells the muscles to lower, but I only have one sound-producing membrane. Birds have what's called a syrinx, unlike our larynx, and there are two independent sound-producing membranes. So birds, songbirds, excuse me, can play duets with themselves. So let me try this. So the pretty loud. My daughters liked it when I did this through my nose, so. Okay. Now, let me prove to you that birds can sing duets with themselves. Some of our most common and wonderful songsters around here are the thrushes. So the robins have been back and they're singing. Here's the thrushes of North America. Here's songs, the spectrograms of our North American thrushes. I'm going to play you just a few of these in real time and then slowed down to about a quarter real speed. When I play them real speed, they'll sound kind of magical and very cool. But when I play them slowed down, you'll be able to hear the duet that they're singing with themselves. So here's a grade-cheek thrush. Here's a Swainson's thrush. Here it is slowed down. So here's the duet. Here's a very common thrush in our area. Go up to Patty Canyon in the summer, they'll be singing all the time. Slowed down. And here's a wood thrush, which is an eastern thrush. Slow down, it's like Star Wars. All right. Now, so birds have a syrinx, and we're really lucky. Lauren Reineking, who's a flute major, she's from Billings, and she's majoring in flute performance. Claude Debussy wrote a really cool piece called Syrinx, and to sort of capture this musical magic of birds and Greek nymphs and all this sort of stuff. So Lauren's just going to play the first few bars of Syrinx by Claude Debussy. Lauren's got to run to music practice over in the music building. But so Claude Debussy wrote that in 1913, and it was the first piece written for solo flute, especially for that kind of flute with, what do you call them, Lauren? The valves, in 150 years. So this is a really interesting piece of music. All right, 17 years ago, if you were here, how many people were here 17 years ago? Okay, oh, wow, okay. So you guys can go to sleep now. I'm going to tell you about what I think is a really cool study of how young birds learn to sing and bring in some of these elements. So it's a really neat study of how young birds interact. We know social interactions are important. So how birds in our own backyard on Mount Sentinel and Mount Jumbo learn to sing. So here's lazuli buntings. These are one of the most common birds up on Mount Sentinel and Mount Jumbo. They're gorgeous little gems. If you haven't seen them, go up after 12th of May. They're calendar migrants, so 12th of May and after they're here. And here's the really cool and amazing sort of problem. Here's an older male bird, brighter. This guy has a song of his own. Okay, so he sings a good lazuli bunting song. Each older male bunting has one song he sings. Here's a young male that's just arrived back early May, so he's born the previous year. Even though this guy's a little gungy, he's sexually mature. He's trying to get a territory, get some real estate. To do so, he needs a song. So he uses the song to interact with other males, to defend his real estate, and also to attract the babes. When these young males get back, they do not know how to sing. They don't have a song of their own. So my students and I spent a lot of time figuring out what goes on between when these young birds arrive back here and maybe even just a couple weeks later when they develop a song of their own. So I'm going to tell you about that. And it's going to illustrate basically jazz and the importance of social interactions. Here's our study site. So we got really good leg muscles walking all up and down here. Here's looking down. So the M here doesn't stand for Missoula or Montana. It stands for mate choice. And here's the L over on Mount Jumbo. And some of you remember when it wasn't made of concrete all put together, but white painted rocks. And people would go up at night and rearrange the rocks to propose marriage or say legalize it or whatever. So I was riding my bike into work one day. There we go. Lazuli, woohoo! And this L belonged to Loyola High School. And so if kids were bad, the principal would literally send kids up to the rock pile to put all those rocks back there. All right, so just a little bit about how we did these studies. We would put up mist nets up on Mount Sentinel and Mount Jumbo, and there's a net there, and the whole point is you can't see it. We would hide speakers in the bushes on either side of these nets. And so let's say there's a male bunting downhill. We'd have a speaker hidden here. We'd play one lazuli bunting song. The territorial male, it would sound like somebody was scamming on his turf. He would come screaming in here. And the next song we would play from the other side of the net. And we got so good at this, it would just take us two songs, one from this side, one from that side. The guy would fly right into the net. And we did very careful studies of their plumage. We would give them some jewelry, so some color bands on their legs that they would keep on for life, but we could identify them individually for the rest of their life. We had some birds. We had one bird, Big Red, who lived 15 years. And these guys migrate to Central America. They're this big. And he would come back year after year and to the same bush and sing on the same twig. We could follow, so we knew everybody on Mount Sentinel and Mount Jumbo. We could follow them around, record their songs. And before I tell you about this fascinating question of how these young birds learn to sing, I have to tell you a little bit more about how the older birds sing. Okay, so here are the songs of 5 adult male lazuli buntings. And just now that you're experts at reading spectrograms, you can see that these 5 males have completely different songs. And these were recorded just like right behind us here, just like right there. So they weren't very far apart, and yet you can see that they're very different. A good bird watcher, a good naturalist, can hear a lazuli bunting song and say, ah, that's a lazuli bunting, because they have some sweet notes, which tend to be these thin, pure lines, but they also have raspy, buzzy elements, which are these slightly thicker things. So I'm going to play these 3 male songs in real time. You probably won't be able to follow along the spectrogram because it's so fast. So here's white over yellow. That was the bling on his legs. Here's green. And here's PB. Okay? So now I'm going to play them slowed down. Let's start at the bottom, PB. Now we'll be able to follow along in slowed down. Okay, here's Greene. Okay, and white over yellow. I did have one remarkable student who was a musician and had perfect pitch. And we were out one day and he heard a bunting and he said, oh, he's singing Worms Crawl In. I said, what do you mean? And because we have a catalog, each of these syllables has a different number. This is syllable 81 in the alphabet of Leslie Bunting's. And he said, oh, that's the worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. I said, what are you talking about? He said, you know the song, the worms crawl in, the worms crawl out, the worms play pinochle on your snout. Well, here it is, Leslie Bunting style. All right, so now that you know a little bit more about the songs of older males, what do these young guys do? Here are 5 songs of one particular young male recorded, so over maybe a minute. He sang this, then he sang that, then he sang that, then he sang that, then he sang that. So older males, every time they open their mouth, they have a crystallized song. Try it one more time. There we go. So the older males have what we call a crystallized song, and every time they sing, the same thing comes out. If you look at this young bird, with the help of a computer, we can identify where he got every single acoustic element in these songs. And if he was a University of Montana student, he would get kicked out for plagiarism so fast. Because you can see what this young guy was doing. Actually, maybe we should relax the plagiarism rules a little bit. We can identify with the computer that the first part of this song he had copied from another older male that he was interacting with, white over red. Then he tacked some of yellow over white song on the end of that. The next time he opened his mouth 20 seconds later, he just sang yellow over white song. Then 20 seconds later, he went back to white over red, but he put green metal over white on the end, and so on. And these guys, they could sing, it's like they had the top 40 hits on Mount Sentinel and Mount Jumbo in their heads, and they could rearrange them in all these weird different ways. This is what we call the sampling phase, and it was just absolutely astounding. These birds were doing really remarkable things. Here's one of the most remarkable examples I know of a bird in a sampling phase. So this is a bird from Mount Sentinel right above us, and he sang this one song. It has 6 different syllable types, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different sorts of acoustic structures. And with the help of a computer again, we could identify where he got every single one of those sounds. And it turns out that every one of those different syllables he borrowed or he copied from a different male. And this example is pretty incredible. It shows that these young birds pay attention to what we might call syntax. That is, order is important. So you can see that the first syllable type here was the first syllable type of that bird. The second syllable type, 1, 2. 1, 2 is the second syllable type of this bird, 1, 2. And there's not a perfect one-to-one correspondence, but these lines don't cross. So middle and terminal elements of the song tutors, they keep as middle and terminal elements. The other amazing thing about this example is these older male song tutors, we knew who they were, and they were spread all out over Mount Sentinel, from the bottom to the top, from the M all the way over to the golf course. So these young males were traveling around and interacting, and they had stored up on their little noggins all of these songs from all of these different males. Amazing. Then, so you might follow a young bird around one day, and they're doing this sampling stuff, just amazing. You go up the next day, a switch has flipped, and they're no longer sampling. They're in what we call the attrition phase. They're no longer mixing stuff up. They're starting to throw stuff away and come up with their own song. And so you can see here's this same bird, and here's 1, 2, 3, 4 songs, and you can see now they're all the same. And so he's starting to pare it down and come up with a crystallized song of his own. So these young birds can kind of go around and sample the ideas, the musical ideas that are out there, and put them together in a unique new way. So this is just kind of one example of studies that local birds that my students and I have done, but what have we learned as scientists studying birdsong in general? Quite an astounding amount. So people who study the brains of birds and how they learn to sing, which I don't do, but we now have incredibly detailed neurological maps of all of these different centers in the brains of birds that are involved in song learning. And so you can see it's a really complicated wiring diagram. But it turns out that when we learn to speak as infants, we basically share the same neurological wiring. We have sensitive phases where we have to hear language to learn to speak and so forth. So we share, so we not only understand at sort of gross brain level how different structures in the brain are involved, but we understand sort of at the molecular and detailed biochemical level what sorts of things happen inside the brains of birds, young birds, as they learn to sing. Okay, this will be on the final exam. And here's an interesting, here's another cool thing. You know, sort of the dogma is that we're born with a bunch of neurons in the jello in our head, and as we get older, we don't grow nerves, they just die, and we begin the long, slow slide, and things get grim and all that sort of stuff. But some birds, for example, canaries, at the end of every breeding season, they ditch some of their brain. They just throw it away. And before the next breeding season, they regrow huge parts of their brains, and they've got lots of neurons regrowing, making new connections. They learn to sing again. So here's an interesting paper that came out in a medical journal, From Canaries to the Clinic. So you can understand there's a ton of medical interest in understanding how birds' brains work. If they can regrow nerves and make new connections, this might really help us with degenerative neurological diseases that people get, like Alzheimer's and so forth. So there's a lot of interest in understanding this. This is an interesting picture that was in Science journal a while ago, and this was an issue devoted to exploring the fact that what we know about birds and their brains and singing applies basically to lots and lots of vertebrates that communicate and learn to do things. And this process that I've told you about is essentially what goes on in school, we hope, and jazz, which is sampling the ideas of the people that have come before and sort of figuring out what you like and what you don't like and putting those ideas together in new, interesting ways. So that's what the young buntings do, and that's what jazz is all about, and learning and all sorts of stuff. So what I'm going to do now is show you a little compilation of jazz that I've put together. And so from this example, I'm going to start with Paul Desmond and Dave Brubeck's famous Take 5, F sharp minor, a really cool key. And so I'm going to play some of the original version and then just a few little short segments of other people. And you'll see this is much like the buntings. You'll recognize the original theme, but the people have put their own twist on it in interesting ways. Not bad for a bunch of white guys. So this is the great jazz guitarist George Benson. He just ended a fairly straight through rendition. Now he goes nuts for about 20 minutes. This is a Bulgarian a cappella group. And this is a mashup version by the group Radiohead. It's a little hard to recognize here, but watch what happens. All right, so we have jazz, and a lot of our creative activities are because of the shared neurological wiring that we have with birds. The same basic creative processes are involved. So pretty cool, I think. All right, just really quickly, I want to talk about another really important way that birds communicate with each other. So now, first I've been talking about songs, which are mainly used in courtship and reproduction. The other really important thing that birds talk to each other about is danger. Okay, so predation is a huge, huge deal in the animal world. Okay, not just for birds. And it turns out that most critters have what we call alarm calls, which are very, very cool. They warn each other. They make sounds or other sorts of signals to warn each other that there's danger in the area. So here's a pika saying that there's danger around. So for a lot of small birds, about 80 to 90% of mortality is because of predators, such as the sharp-shinned hawk. Now, birds, a lot of birds have, they say, they have all sorts of things they say. They have words for snake on the ground and mammal on the ground, mammal in the trees. I'm going to just focus on a couple really important ones that you might hear around here. This is really interesting. Here's a little chickadee. If it sees a raptor in flight, so danger in the air, it will produce a very specific kind of sound that we call a seat alarm call. On a spectrogram, it looks like this, and it's very high and thin, and it's hard to hear. If you're in the woods, they're very, very easy to miss, but here's what they sound like. If you're in the woods and you hear that, look around. That bird has seen a hawk flying somewhere. It might not show up for like 2 or 3 minutes, but there is a hawk in the air somewhere. Now, here's another really cool thing. If that flying hawk lands, and it is now, oh, and here's another really neat thing. When other birds or mammals too hear a seat alarm call, it produces a really amazing behavioral response. Since there's danger in the air, this is a really dangerous time. Things dive for the bushes, or they freeze. Like if they think they're vulnerable, they will just freeze and like just look around. And I'll show you a cool video of that. if the same hawk, the sharp-shinned hawk that was flying, if it lands, now birds will produce a completely different signal. We call it a mobbing signal. And they tend to be very loud, broadband, lots of frequencies, and very harsh. And if any of you know really annoying birders who we call pishers, they go out and go. There's a reason it works. It brings birds out of the bushes. The reason it works is because here's what, for chickadees, here's what the D, that harsh D, that is a mobbing signal. And the behavioral response of other birds is to call in the troops. So rather than everybody ducking for cover, birds actually approach the perched raptor. This may seem counterintuitive, like why would you go close to a dangerous predator? Well, what happens is lots and lots of birds go, and since it's perched, it's actually not very maneuverable. It's not as dangerous. And so you get a big mobbing response, and they'll biff it on the head, and its cover has been busted. Things know it's around. And so what we know from a lot of studies is perched raptors, if there's a mobbing response, they will tend to just get out of dodge, fly a long way away. If they hadn't been discovered, they would tend to fly short little distances and try to nail somebody. Okay, so if there's a mobbing response by a lot of individuals, it's a very effective way to move them on. Now, people have known about mobbing responses for a long time. This is a 3,000-year-old Greek vase. And if you look carefully, here's a perched owl. And look in this bush. There are lots of birds flying around mobbing it, right? Well, there's a guy actually making his living by the behavior of mobbing. If you look carefully, here's a guy over here. This is his captive owl. He's tethered it out, and before he tethered it out, he smeared basically crazy glue, lime, on all the branches here. So a lot of these birds are stuck in the branches. So one of these birds gave a mobbing response. Everybody flies in. They get stuck in the bushes. He goes, picks them up, puts them in, and goes to the market and sells them for the soup pot. So 3,000 years ago, a guy was making his living based on knowing about the behavior of mobbing responses. Here's a neat mosaic from the 1700s. This is a little owl in Europe, and you can see how close these birds are getting. Here's a real interesting thing. Look how many species there are. Here's a European robin, a bullfinch. There's an albino something. So there's lots of different species that all respond and come in. It's not just one species. So, and here's one of my favorite depictions of a mobbing event. This is a lush, sort of romantic painting by a guy named Tobias Stranover in about 1758. This is a European eagle owl, big owl. And if you look carefully, there's birds from 5 continents that have come to help mob this bird. So here's a blue jay. It's flown from North America all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to help mob an owl in Europe. Here's a golden pheasant, a Himalayan pheasant that's come all the way from Nepal, and so on and so forth. These are caciques from Oropendolas from South America, and so forth. So you can see these mobbing responses, these mobbing calls are powerful signals. Now, drum roll. Dylan, please. How do we study this? How do my students and I study this now? We're experimentally studying these sorts of behaviors in acoustics with what we call roboraptors. And here's a robo-goshawk. And so we can put these fake tree trunks out in the woods, and here's a robo-goshawk looking around at you, and we can record the mobbing responses of birds. And this one needs a little help. Oops, there we go. Here is a robo-pygmy owl. This is a life-size pygmy owl. This is our smallest owl around here. And so we've teamed up with lots and lots of people to do this cool stuff. Here's a taxidermist who helped us. There's motors. There's little computers that drive this stuff. Here's a Cooper's hawk and the robo-pygmy owl. Here's a robo-great horned owl. We've got little ones, big ones. So experimentally, we now can go out with these things with very sensitive microphones in the woods and look at how far and how fast this information travels. What we're finding is a complex distant early warning system where basically all the species in the woods, and not only birds, but squirrels and chipmunks are participating. We've documented that this wave of information can travel over 100 miles an hour. And when raptors fly through the woods, we can see a bow wave of information preceding that going 100 miles an hour or so. Colin Corbett, who's in the audience right here, is sort of the brains behind a lot of the electronics and the computers that run this. So without Colin, none of this would have been possible. Here's this mosaic showing a mobbing response. It's sort of static, but I want to give you a sense of what these mobbing responses, how powerful these signals are, these mobbing signals, what a mobbing response looks like. So here's a video that we made just a few weeks ago, just up Rattlesnake. So here's the robo-pygmy owl getting closed in, and there's Jesse and Dylan, students helping out on the project. So this is before the trunk comes down. Here's a nuthatch just doing its stuff, some chickadees just messing around. Now one bird gives an alarm call, and watch what happens. So you can see there's many species involved in this mobbing. There's red-breasted nuthatches, black-capped chickadees. So you can imagine if this was a real live pygmy owl and all this was going on, it might encourage you to kind of leave the neighborhood. And they'll actually hit this thing on the back of the head. Up it goes. Bye-bye. All right, I want to show you one more quick video, and then one more thing, and we'll finish up pretty quickly. Remember, so that was a mobbing response. Okay, that calls in lots of birds, and they go crazy. What I'm going to show you now is some footage we just filmed up near Clinton the other day. This shows what happens with birds when they hear a seat call. Okay, when there's a predator that's flying. And what I want you to notice first is there'll be some nuthatches and other birds. Watch the nuthatches. I mean, they're like ADD kids. They're just, they're moving all over the place. You'll hear a seat call. Most of the birds that are on the feeders just dive instantly, but there's one nuthatch that's kind of vulnerable, and you'll see it freeze. Okay, you see nuthatches never sit still. There's the seat call. Now the other birds that were on the feeder dove for the bushes. Look at this nuthatch. It freezes, and it sat there for about 20 minutes with a seed in its mouth. And we can watch all 20 minutes of it if you want. But you can see this is a signal, a very, very subtle acoustic signal, and yet you see it has an incredible, it elicits an amazing behavioral response of these birds. Diving, the birds that dove into the bushes, they are now frozen. This guy was sort of the most vulnerable. He's just hanging out, just to figure out where this threat was from. All right, since we're a little past 8, I'm going to zoom through some stuff with the help of Chris Templeton, who is a former student of mine, and Kate Davis, who's in the audience here. We've sort of cracked the code of chickadee alarm calls. Here's a chickadee mobbing call. For some reason, it doesn't want to play. Now, here's the pygmy owl. And just, again, to give you a size scale, I have to apologize, Kate, I can't talk her out of drinking crappy beer. But it does give you a size scale. But I am happy to announce that our local Big Sky Brewery was inspired by pygmy owls and came up with Pygmy Owl Itty Bitty IPA. And so since my research is funded by National Science Foundation, I stuck this on here. And I sent some of this to the director of National Science Foundation and said, this has got to be like the best use of National Science Foundation money for like getting science out to the people. Like, what's better than getting good microbrew beer out to the people to replace this stuff, you know? And the director of National Science Foundation wrote back to me and said, actually, I don't like IPAs. So here's Jillian. This is Jillian's still alive, right, Kate? Yep. How old is she now? 12 years old. So Jillian is a rock star. This was .com, rest in peace now, little pygmy owl. But with the help of Chris Templeton and funded by Big Dipper, fueled by Big Dipper, and Kate and a lot of her birds, we were able to do presentations in experimental aviaries and show something very, very cool. Let me walk you through the graph. This is the number of D notes on a chickadee call, and this is the size of a predator. This is wingspan. So here's a pygmy owl, a little tiny thing way down here. Here's a great horned owl up here. And it turns out that the small raptors are the most dangerous for chickadees, because if a chickadee flits, a small raptor can stay on its tail. It's just aerodynamics. A larger raptor, think of like a 747 or a golden eagle, it's got a big turning radius. So if a chickadee flits, there's no way a golden eagle can take it. So it turns out that if you hear a chickadee in the woods going chickadee dee 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 dee, lots of D's, go look, there's probably a small raptor out there. And if you hear a chickadee going chickadee dee dee, there might be a great horned owl. Okay, so they encode a ton of information. We've done lots of experiments. They're telling each other not only that there's danger, but what species of raptor is out there. Okay, and other species, like nuthatches, understand chickadees. Squirrels understand birdies. Birds understand squirrelies. It's turning out to be an amazing communication network of everybody listening in on everybody else. What I want to end with is Craig Naylor, who's a world-class composer and musician. He was inspired by chickadees and wrote a 4-movement symphony called Chickadee Symphony. And it had its debut here a couple of years ago with James Smart, who's conductor here in the music department, and the Symphonic Wind Ensemble. And Craig Naylor got a grant, and he spent a couple years doing amazing research about chickadees. He knows like way more about chickadee vocalizations than just about anybody. The third movement is called Danger, and he dedicated it to Chris Templeton, the grad student, who worked with Kate Davis and I, figuring this stuff out. So here's Craig Naylor. Kate came along and brought Jillian and .com, and here's Dr. Smart with students playing this piece. Now, here's just a couple brief excerpts from this amazing piece of music. First of all, so here's a great horned owl hooting. Okay, and now I'm going to play a part from the symphony. If you listen carefully, you'll hear a great horned owl tooting. Then you'll hear some chickadees that are getting pissed off, but they're not really that pissed off, right? Because it's a big bird. There's the owl. Okay, they're annoyed, but just wait till they hear the pygmy owl. So here's a pygmy owl tooting. Can you hear them in the woods now? They're calling a lot. Now, here's part of the symphony. You'll hear the pygmy owl tooting. Then you'll hear some really high, the piccolo giving really high frequency chickadee, high danger calls, and then you'll hear all hell break loose, which is what chickadees do if there's a pygmy owl around. Here's the pygmy owl. It's the chickadee. All right, so I hope I've convinced you tonight that birds say a lot of pretty amazing things when they open their mouth. They have a lot to say. They're communicating a lot of information to each other. We're only beginning to understand all the subtleties and nuances of the sort of information they're conveying to each other. And we share an awful lot of the basic neurological wiring that birds have, and it allows us to do a lot of the cool stuff we do, such as learning to speak and play music and communicate with each other. All right, thanks very much.
Okay, so I'm sure we have a lot of questions, and there are going to be 3 microphones roundabout. Susan's back over there. We're going to have one in about the middle and one over on this side. So please put up your hand and wait until we call on you before you start to ask your question, because people won't be able to understand you. Okay, here's somebody right in the front.
Hi. I live out in the Target Range area. I've been listening for meadowlarks. They're not making their typical call that I have heard in the last week or two, and I'm just curious about that.
Well, I've heard meadowlarks for about 3 weeks out at Target Range, and I've heard them singing normal songs. So, okay. Where in Target Range do you live?
7th and Clements.
I've heard them not about a block from there. So, yeah.
Dr. Greene.
Yeah.
Dr. Greene, did Lucasfilms consult with you and they came up with the voice for R2-D2?
Yes.
Were you paid? That's what
There's actually a funny story. So you're talking about the wood thrush? Yeah. So there's actually a funny story about wood thrushes. In Hollywood, there's like stock sound libraries that people who are making movies, they can go order up sounds to put in their soundtracks. And so, especially in like grade B sort of Western movies, if the cowboys are riding along in the woods in Ponderosa Pine Forest and they want to convey a nice, peaceful, bucolic atmosphere, I guarantee you they play the song of a wood thrush, which is interesting because it's a range extension. It's an eastern species. You don't find it here. But they also play it slowed down to about 3/4 of real speed. So listen in any soundtrack. If you hear a slowed down wood thrush, things are cool. But then when you hear the red-tailed hawk screaming, you know the bad guys are right around the corner and an ambush is going to happen.
Eric,
Yes.
the white-capped sparrow that learned the redbird's song, what was his fate?
So the question was the white-crowned sparrow that learned the strawberry finch's song, what was his fate? That's a good question. It was a captive bird in a little cage, so maybe he got lucky with the strawberry finch babes. But this was not a wild bird. So this was a lab study, but you know, what it showed was pretty remarkable. That it was the first clue we had that social interactions were so important. They could even override innate preferences for learning your own song. Yes?
You said earlier on that you believe certain birds hear slowed down. How would you go about determining that? And if they hear slowed down, how do they ever catch up? Wouldn't they miss a lot of stuff?
Good question. Well, yeah, it's impossible to know what birds really hear, what their sensations are. But the sorts of experiments that people have done is, to a young bird, you can play a song and they will learn it. You can take out, with a computer, you can take out a tiny, tiny little bit of a song that they hear, and they can tell it's gone, and they will learn it without that little tiny part. We cannot even, if you try to do that with humans, you can take out huge big chunks. We don't even know it's gone. So we can take out the tiniest little bits of sound, and young birds tell us that they kind of hear that because they don't include it in their songs. So the closest thing I can imagine is that, you know, they're able to resolve sound along that sort of time axis far, far, far better than we can.
Could you play from your nose again?
Eric, I have a question.
Yes.
Lou Bruno over here. In the back.
Yes. Hi.
I spend the summers in East Glacier, and probably our most common town bird at East Glacier is the white-crowned sparrow. And they sing a dialect that I've never heard anywhere else out of Glacier. I used to do a breeding bird survey from St. Mary out into the prairie, and on that survey, about half of them sang the dialect and half of them didn't. The East Glacier birds always start their song with a 2-note whistle, almost like a chickadee whistle. So how do these birds, in a place like where there are, I'm hearing different males that are singing the two dialects, how do the chicks growing up differentiate between the two?
That's a fantastic question, and as I said, I'm just really scratching the surface of bird song, but you've really hit on something really important. Some birds, some species, don't have any geographic structure to their song. So everywhere in North America, chickadees are singing their love song now. What is it? The cheeseburger. Okay, those are chickadee males saying, "Come on, babes." Everywhere in North America, chickadees say, except on one tip of Martha's Vineyard. They say something slightly different. Other birds do different things and have geographic dialects, and white-crowned sparrows are famous for this. So white-crowned sparrows will have a group of birds here sing a song that is, and all males in that area sing the same thing. You can cross, and it can be a river or even a highway, and across that highway or river, it can be another dialect, and everybody over there sings something different. And so we don't really understand a lot about that, but in Korea, where are you, Korea? Korea studied white-crowned sparrows a lot in some of the famous areas that people did early studies. But we know that females, young chicks, when they're just tiny, even though they don't grow up to sing a song, they imprint on their dad's song. And so when they grow up, they don't mate with somebody who's singing their dad's song. But young males, the process by which they learn a dialect is pretty complicated. Creed, do you want to say anything?
They tend to learn their fathers, they learn it from their fathers, and there can be overlap of dialects within meadows, and the young tend to learn what their father sings. We have one example from about 15 years of study showing one male changing dialect mid-season.
Yeah.
Other than that, everyone learns that dialect and sticks with that dialect.
So I don't know if you could all hear that, but Crew studied white-crowned sparrows a lot. Young males tend to learn their father's song or that dialect and tend to return close by. Females tend to disperse farther and not end up mating in their own natal dialect.
Yeah, could you say something about how mockingbirds learn to sing?
Ooh, mockingbirds. Mockingbirds are in a really interesting family called the Mimidae, the mimics. And mockingbirds and brown thrashers and birds like that are exceptional at learning to copy things. And a mockingbird can have thousands of different songs that it will sing. They seem to get larger repertoires as they get older, and birds with the largest repertoires, females tend to find the sexiest.
Have you studied any of the non-songbirds? I mean, songbirds are the most highly evolutionary bird. What about some of the ones that are not so evolutionary?
Yeah, so that's a great question. What about birds that are not songbirds? So things like woodpeckers or flycatchers or other things, more primitive, what we might call primitive birds, don't have this degree of learning that I've talked about with the white-crowned sparrows and showed you with the buntings. And so there are differences. People have done studies where you can actually do things like, I wouldn't want to do this work, but you can take a young chick and deafen it by cutting its auditory nerve. So it's deaf and it never hears anything, and yet they end up singing perfect songs of their own species. So there are some birds that don't have this learning component. It's just all hardwired in their noggin. And they don't need to hear anything. They just can crank it out. Yes?
Are the mechanical and neurological abilities of birds' ears greater than humans?
I'm not quite sure what you mean, but they have about the same hearing sensitivity, so they don't hear much higher frequencies than we do. So the frequencies, the pitches that they hear are very similar to what we hear. So it's not like they can hear up into bat range, but what we know is that they must be able, and I've used this analogy, they must be able to hear it like it's slowed down. They're able to somehow neurologically process sound information much faster than we seem to be able to do.
And so is their discrimination ability of sound comparable or greater?
It seems to be, yes, yes. Okay. So there's experiments been done messing around with songs at a very fine level and doing behavioral experiments, and the birds can tell us that they can detect those differences where we couldn't.
Yeah, I once watched a watering hole with a whole variety of birds surrounding it, and then all of a sudden they all disappeared, and I looked up and it was a loggerhead shrike was there, and it scared them all away. It was the first time I'd seen one, so I watched him for about 10 minutes. When he took off, it was only then that I realized there was still one bird remaining. It was a white-crowned sparrow that had totally frozen so well that I didn't even see him. My question, though, is you mentioned the experiment with exposing white-crowned sparrows to several different varieties of songs at the crucial stage, including a white-crowned sparrow song. Was there ever an experiment in which it was exposed to several songs without the white-crowned sparrow song? And if so, was there a result?
That's a great question. Dick, do you know the answer to that? I'm not sure. I don't know of any experiment that's been done like that. It would be interesting. You know, one of the things that I'm such a technological Luddite that, I mean, I use technology when I need to or have to, but I mainly rely on my students to say, help me figure out which buttons to push. But I think this example from the very simple experiment of a white-crowned sparrow having something alive to interact with, and that overrides powerful, innate predispositions to learn its own species song, I think is really powerful for educators, for example, because there's growing movements to rely more and more on technology and computers, and I give every kid in school an iPad and all this sort of stuff. And in one of the latest National Geographics, there was a really interesting study exposing really, really young infants. I think they were like 4 months old. And these were not Chinese infants, but they were played Mandarin Chinese. So it was kind of like this experiment with the white-crowned sparrows. So they were through a speaker, they were played Mandarin Chinese, and then they were showed a computer screen, and they heard Mandarin Chinese, but they also saw on the screen the person speaking. And then the third treatment was an actual live person interacting with them speaking Mandarin Chinese. And these were tiny, tiny little infants. And what do you think happened? It was the small infants that there was a real live person there, and their brains, they were soaking that stuff up for the sound or the computer and the sound. They didn't care. Their brains didn't do anything. And when you think about it, if you ask students, if you ask anybody, why did you end up getting interested in what you do, I usually hear, oh, I had a really great high school or junior high school teacher or something like that that really turned me on. I never usually hear is, oh, I had this great computer program. And those guys probably living in their mom's basement. No, I'm sorry. Yes?
What other things do they talk about besides mating and...
Oh, birds?
Yeah. Chinese people. No.
So I just focused on courtship songs and territorial songs and danger, but birds make a lot of different sounds. When they're nesting, they have all sorts of chips to talk to their mates, like I'm over here, you're over there. So contact calls, so staying sort of social cohesion. Talking to their babies, like I'm coming in to feed you, or stay quiet, there's danger around. When they're migrating, they can be thousands of feet in the air, and they give different kinds of calls for the flocks at night in the dark to stay together. So there's lots and lots and lots of different things that birds say. We're only beginning to understand the sort of Rosetta Stone of the language for even the commonest things like robins and chickadees. We don't know, most of what robins say, we don't know what it means.
If you are thinking the connection of the speed of processing of the sound, is there any correlation between the pulse rate of the birds?
The pulse rate of the sound?
No, the heartbeat of the birds is speeding the processing up.
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. Kriya's got her hand raised.
The way I would think about it is, if you think about the proportion here, if you think about the proportion of our brain dedicated to interpreting sound and making it, and think about the proportion of the bird brain dedicated to interpreting sound and making it, a much larger proportion of their brain is used for interpretation and production. And we have many of those same nuclei, those same areas in the brain, but they take up so much less of what our brain is made up of, that the processing power per gram of animal is much, much higher, is
So-
how I would think about it.
And you were asking about heart rate?
In terms of metabolic rates, birds are higher, but that's because they're smaller. Mice have higher metabolic rates too. It doesn't have anything to do with a faster neural processing.
One thing that is interesting about, you mentioned trills. Birds make trills by doing this really fast with their beaks. And birds that have large beaks, I mean, they've got a great big mass, but with muscles, they have to do this. And so birds with large beaks cannot trill as rapidly as birds. So a grosbeak, if it tried to trill, it's just a mechanical sort of constraint, whereas very small beak birds can trill very rapidly. So there are some morphological constraints or effects on the sounds birds make. There's also some really interesting differences in the sounds that birds make to get through particular habitats. So if each of you was a tree, a bush with leaves, if I made a sound, it would bounce off the leaves and the trunks, and if I was trying to get a sound through to the back of the room, there would be so much reverb and bouncing around that if I made a fast trill, it would be oatmeal mush by the time it got to the back of the room. It wouldn't sound like a trill. So birds that live in really dense forests, if they want to get a signal through, they tend to talk with a real slow drawl. And so a trill has to be really slow. A signal has to be really slow because there's so much reverb before it gets to the back of the room. But the same species, if it lives, say, in an open prairie, it can trill its heart out, and females seem to like that. So you can look at the same species of birds across, like from a prairie into a forest, and their songs change in really interesting ways.
One more question, Jeff.
Jeff?
17 years later, I'm still fascinated by the Zulu bunting research that you did. And when you talked about the younger birds sampling older birds and taking pieces of their song, it makes me wonder, the older birds did the same thing. And so these songs and pieces of songs are like legacy sounds. Do you have any idea how far back you can track a piece of a song, how many generations it's gone around?
We've still got some song dialects up on Mount Sentinel. We've still got some songs that are being sung up there that were sung 17 years ago. They're not from the same birds, but they're from young birds learning those songs and passing them down. And, now that you asked, Jeff, here is Red, a very famous bird. This is the guy who lived for about 15 years. And he's a very, very bright male. And the technical term for him, for biologists, is he was a high voltage power stud. We found his DNA all over Mount Sentinel. And this is a good monogamous bird, right? And we would see banded females flying a mile and going and mating with him and going back to hubby, and hi, I was out bowling with the girls. And so anyway, here's his song, and so we know from the genetic evidence, the DNA, that females found him very attractive. And here are the songs of young birds. And look, they copied. Somehow they recognized that Red was an especially attractive bird. They copied his song. So this is like 17 years ago. His song is still up there. He's no longer alive. These guys are no longer alive. Here's something rather astounding. One year he came back, and so Red was there, and there's all these Red wannabes singing his song. He came back, he changed his song. So all these younger birds were singing the old version. He sings a new version. There it is. So he changed his song from that to that. Now it's an interesting thing. He's still there, and there's still this rain of young birds coming in. His old song is numerically much more common out there, because there's all these young birds that have learned his old song. There's only one of his new song. Guess what song the young birds coming in sing? His new song. So very interesting things like that. These are results that we could never, ever anticipate with lab studies. These sorts of field studies with known marked individuals are opening a window on sort of the complexity and the beauty of these sort of amazing behavioral interactions in the natural world. But to answer your question, there still are songs up on Mount Sentinel that were there 17 years ago. And they're culturally transmitted.
I'm not going to sing, but I'm going to say I think it's probably time for us to close up.
Here, you can play. Emily Grassley will be speaking next week. If you can make it. It should be amazing.
And she'll be our final speaker. And Eric, you'll take some questions if people want to come up with that. Okay, wonderful. Thanks, everyone.